JSP 3rd Gen Prelude episode number 7. In this episode, we're going to dive deep into disassembling our H22A1 engine. This engine came with the project, but I don't have a lot of history about it. I was told that it runs and that it's in good shape, but I don't know much else. Just to be sure, I want to pull the cylinder head off and just give it a little bit of a refresh. Maybe a valve job, some new valve seals, and clean it up. We're also going to clean the engine block and refresh it with some new gaskets and seals. The H22 engine is a 2.2 liter dual overhead cam VTEC engine sold by Honda. It originally was released, I think, in 1992 in the Prelude VTEC and has about 190 horsepower. Besides being a high compression dual overhead cam VTEC engine, this engine also has a variable intake system which increases torque at lower RPM using a butterfly system in the intake manifold. It also has a pair of balancing shafts that run off of the crankshaft, which keep the engine running smooth at higher RPMs. Typically, engines over 2 liters have a lot of harmonic problems at higher RPM, and this is what Honda did to try to combat that. We're going to keep this engine pretty much stock, but there are a couple of small known issues with the H22 when it comes to reliability. The factory timing belt tensioner can be prone to failing over time, causing the timing to skip and causing engine damage. So what we're going to do is we're going to replace the factory timing belt tensioner with an aftermarket manual tensioner. This will allow us to adjust the tension and fix it in place so that it's not constantly being tensioned and there's no chance for it to fail. With the intake manifold removed, we can look into the intake ports and just make sure that there isn't any catastrophic failure. We're also going to keep an eye out to see if there's any unusual leaks that we didn't notice before. Before we pulled the engine out of the car, we drained all the oil and coolant, but there's usually still some residual oil and coolant in the engine that you don't get out just by pulling the drain plugs. On the back of the H22 engine, below the water pipe that connects the water pump to the thermostat housing is a large drain bolt. This drains all of the additional coolant from around the cylinder walls. Most of the time these come off pretty easily, but for some reason this one was really stubborn. I usually like to use hand tools when removing parts off of engines whenever possible, but sometimes you have to resort to using impacts. In this case, the breaker bar wasn't enough to loosen it. Before pulling the impact though, I did decide to try to warm up the bolt with a little bit of heat. Sometimes if a bolt is corroded into an engine block, it'll be a little bit tighter than normal, and adding a bit of heat can break that loose. However, even after the torch, this bolt did not want to come off with the breaker bar, so out comes the impact. My little 3/8 electric impact didn't do it, so I pulled out my pneumatic 3/8 impact. This also was struggling and was not able to take off the bolt. This forced me to pull out my large 1/2-inch Ingersoll impact, which usually only gets used about once a year for that one bolt that doesn't want to come off. It loosened the bolt with basically zero effort. The bolt is a large diameter fine pitch thread with a metric aluminum crush washer. The reason they use a fine pitch thread is because fine pitch thread bolts are less likely to loosen over time, and having this back out on the engine would not be good. With the coolant drained, now I go ahead and start removing all the rest of the accessories. I'm going to start with pulling off the spark plug cover, the spark plug wires, the distributor, the VTEC solenoid, the thermostat housing, and the crossover water pipe under the intake manifold. When pulling these MagnaCore plug wires out of the valve cover, I noticed that they didn't fit very well and they weren't even really sticking onto the spark plugs. I'm guessing these probably aren't the right ones for this engine. We'll end up just replacing them with an OEM or NGK spark plug wire. One of my favorite features of the H22 is its valve cover itself. The fact that it has a gigantic VTEC logo on the very front of it is really funny to me. While Honda's usually a very subtle company, and only on their Type R models or special models do they do anything that's extravagant or unusually bold, the H22 engine just is like, hey yo, I got VTEC, what you got? With the distributor, the VTEC solenoid both removed, now it's time to remove the thermostat housing, which is one of the last things that connects the head to the engine block as far as accessories goes. Depending how long this has been assembled or not disassembled, the O-ring on these can sometimes be a little bit sticky and hard to remove. Usually I just use a screwdriver in between. There's a little flange area where it attaches to the water pump and you can pop it out. Now you can see we're getting pretty stripped down on the engine here. There's only a couple of sensors left in the front upper water neck housing. On the back side of the engine, you can see there's not really anything connecting the cylinder head to the engine block besides the timing stuff. We can even look in the back side of the water pump here and we can see, luckily, it looks like it's clean and new. With all that stuff taken care of, now it's time to get to the valve cover, remove the valve cover, and take a look inside the cylinder head itself. I want to take a look at the camshafts, the rocker assembly, and just all the valve train in general to see what kind of condition it's in. With the hardware removed, the valve cover just pops off with a little bit of a flat screwdriver on each side. These valve covers don't usually have any silicone or RTV sealing them to the engine except for just around a couple of the cam caps, so they pop off without any problems. After I pull the valve cover off, I just want to look inside and see if there's anything that looks unusual, like sludge or debris or things like that. The inside of this valve cover is extremely clean. I'm guessing that it was taken off pretty recently. Let's take a look inside the engine and see what we've got going on. The first thing I noticed is, unusually, there's a bunch of grit on top of the cam caps. This is something that's not good, not ordinary, and something I'm glad that we took the engine apart to find. Grit and debris like this would definitely get washed down into the oil pan and then pumped through all of the oil galleys of the engine. This is not good. I'm glad that we found this so that we can prevent any damage to the engine. After seeing that debris, it's time to take a little bit of a closer look inside of the valve train. Looking down into all of the valves and rockers, I don't see anything that is really unusual or standing out except for maybe there's a little bit of wear on some of these VTEC lobes, but nothing extreme. I've definitely seen a lot worse. So let's get down and start taking apart the timing assembly. The first step to removing the timing assembly is to take off the crank pulley. This just has a single bolt in the center holding it in place. It's a slip fit onto the crankshaft with just a woodruff key that keeps it oriented correctly. It should slide off easily. I was told by the previous owner that this engine had a new timing belt, new balance belt, and a couple of new seals and other stuff going on. I'm interested to see what it looks like when I get all these timing covers removed to see what exactly they have done. With all the covers removed, now we can see everything that's going on in here. It looks like the timing belt is new. It's an aftermarket Gates unit, which I typically prefer to use OEM belts on these. It also has an aftermarket timing belt tensioner. That's a little Chinese unit. Like I said, we're going to replace that with a manual tensioner. Before I remove the timing assembly, I like to put the engine at top dead center. Unfortunately, I forgot to put the engine at top dead center before removing the crank pulley, so I had to bolt it back on again so that I could align everything. The first part of the timing assembly that I remove is the balance shaft belt. Now, if you'll notice, it's a cog-driven belt just like a timing belt. That's because these balance shafts have an orientation that's in relation to the orientation of the timing of the engine. Just like a counterweight on a crankshaft, countering the weight of a piston and connecting rod as the engine spins around to keep everything balanced, the two balance shafts also counteract each other. For the balance shafts to function properly, not only do they have to be aligned correctly so that they're timed together and with the engine's timing, but the intake balance shaft actually spins the opposite direction as the exhaust balance shaft. Typically, the balance shafts actually spin twice the speed of the engine itself, and because they're spinning the opposite direction, they counter each other's inertia. If these aren't timed correctly, you can actually increase the engine's vibration, causing problems later. After getting the timing assembly apart, here's all the stuff that I figured out. It looks like the water pump was replaced with an aftermarket unit, not an OEM unit. That's also going to get replaced with an OEM unit. The Chinese tensioner that we mentioned before, and a couple of the other seals look like they might have been replaced. This balance shaft seal looks pretty fresh. With the timing assembly disassembled, let's start removing the camshafts. I always start with the M6 bolts that are on the outsides of the cam caps because they're not really doing much to hold the cam caps down. After the M6 bolts are removed, then we can start loosening the M8s. These are the ones that actually hold all the cam caps in place. These are supposed to be removed in a cross pattern, just kind of like removing a cylinder head. I like to start by loosening a quarter turn at a time, starting from the outside and working my way inward. Loosening the camshafts in a manner like this is really important to keep them from getting stressed. If you loosen one side of the cam all the way before loosening the rest, it's possible to crack the camshaft or break it in half. This is especially true when you have aftermarket valve springs that are putting additional pressure onto the cams. After I've gone through and loosened the bolts a quarter turn 2 times, then I can go back and just remove all of the hardware. These aluminum bars that go over the cam caps and hold them together not only strengthen the assembly, but they also provide oil lubrication between the different cam caps. When I remove them, I like to keep the hardware intact just to keep everything organized. With those top plates removed, now you can slowly remove the actual cam caps. With a flathead screwdriver, prying in an area that isn't an actual mounting surface, there's plenty of little tabs that are sticking out, you can slowly remove these cam caps. Now they are all numbered so that you don't have to worry about keeping them in the correct order when you remove them, but I still do like to keep them in the correct order when I lay them out onto my paper towels. With the caps removed, now we can get a good look at the camshafts and the cam journals. This is going to be a good indication of the condition of the engine. On an engine that hasn't been very well maintained, you're going to see a lot of scarring on these camshafts in the bearing journals and on the rocker assembly surfaces. While it does look like these camshaft seals were replaced, it also looks like they used a black RTV sealant, which is not the correct sealant, as I would definitely prefer to use Honda Bond. With the camshafts finally removed, we can look into the camshaft bearing journals of the cylinder head. These actually look to be in really good condition. These large diameter holes that are in the camshaft bearing journals are actually the access to the cylinder head bolts. This is how we're going to remove the cylinder head. But before we remove the head, I'm just going to do one last inspection of everything. I'm going to look through and notice things like the scarring on these VTEC rockers. This isn't terrible, but something to be noted. I'm also going to go around and feel for the lost motion assembly. These are the springs that go under the VTEC rocker arms to keep the rocker arms from slapping around when the engine's not in VTEC. Sometimes on higher mileage engines, these can get sticky, and if I've got one that's sticky, I want to know about it before I take the engine apart. The bolts that hold the cylinder head onto the engine block have a 14mm head. They're torqued to about the same as a wheel lug nut, so most of the time you can take a breaker bar and they break loose. Just like when we remove the cam caps, Honda recommends that you start from the outside of the cylinder head and do a crossing pattern working your way to the inside. I like to remove them a quarter turn at a time twice, just like I did with the cam caps. I'm sure by now you've probably noticed that I'm having a little bit of trouble loosening these bolts. Typically a normal breaker bar will do it, but for some reason these bolts were extremely tight to remove, so I decided to grab a little bit of a cheater bar to put onto the breaker bar. Even with the cheater bar, I was still struggling to get that first quarter turn on most of these bolts. The engine stand was moving around, and probably if I had a little bit of help, somebody else holding the engine, maybe it would have been a little bit easier. But again, this is not typical. I've been assembling and disassembling Honda engines for about 25 years, and honestly, this was probably the tightest cylinder head bolt set that I've ever removed. Even after loosening all 10 bolts the first quarter turn, when I went back to go do the second quarter turn on all 10 bolts, it seemed to be just as hard as the first turn. This is extremely unusual and a little bit curious as to why these bolts would have ended up so tight. I'm hoping that there isn't any engine damage or that the engine wasn't potentially overheated, causing the cylinder head to warp and causing these bolts to get tighter. Since the bolts seemed to be over-tightened, I decided with just the regular breaker bar to do a third loosening of the bolts before going back with an impact to loosen them all the rest of the way. By the time I got back to just the regular breaker bar, I was able to do it by hand and they were finally loosening up. The last step before removing the head is just finishing the loosening of all the bolts, and then I like to go in and I like to use a magnet on a stick so that I can easily pull all of the bolts out. You could just leave the bolts in and lift the cylinder head, but I like to remove the bolts just to prevent anything from falling out afterward. When lifting the cylinder head off of the engine, sometimes the head gasket can get stuck between the layers. There's two dowel pins that are either going to stay stuck in the head or stuck in the block, and they can hold on to it a bit. So I usually lift the head just a little bit and see which way the gasket's going to go. I help it to separate, and then I'm able to lift the cylinder head off. With the head and the block separated, now let's take a look to see what's going on. The first thing I'm going to look at is the surface of the cylinder head to see if there's anything that would indicate there was something like a blown head gasket, or even things like corrosion from electrolysis of having bad coolant or a bad electronic system. The surface of this cylinder head looks fine, and I honestly expect this cylinder head to be okay when I send it out to have it cleaned and pressure tested. Unfortunately though, looking into the block, I found a couple of issues. Looking down the cylinder, I noticed this really weird pattern on the cylinder walls. Now, Honda H22 engines don't have a standard cylinder lining. Unlike a steel liner of most engines, this has a fiber reinforced liner that is very thin and pressed into the aluminum block. This makes it so that whenever there's any damage to the cylinder wall, you're not really supposed to do much machining to open up the diameter, because it's possible to go through that cylinder wall lining and into the actual block itself. I believe Honda only recommends about a 0.25 millimeter overbore. I was honestly really stumped at what would have caused this type of a pattern or damage inside of the cylinder walls. At first it looks kind of like a weld repair that somebody has honed out. But after measuring the cylinder diameter, I realized that the bore is still the standard 87 millimeter bore. That means that whatever damage has been caused into these cylinder walls has been done by the engine just operating in normal conditions. What I mean by normal conditions is that this wasn't something that was done by a machine shop or by a catastrophic failure. It is possible that the engine potentially overheated or caused damage to the cylinder walls in some other way, like a fuel mixture problem or something like that. Unfortunately, I don't think that this engine block is going to be reusable. So as it sits, I'm going to be on the hunt for a new H22 engine block to use. So once I got to this point and determined that the engine was not really going to be usable, there's kind of no point in disassembling it any further. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the video here, and I'm going to go source a new engine block, and then we'll continue the next video from that point. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please comment below or feel free to reach out to us directly.